Thank you, Mr. Caton, and may I say it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'm sure I will learn much as I chair the Welsh Affairs Select Committee from such esteemed colleagues as your good self. May I say that it's a pleasure that we're actually debating energy policy as it relates to Britain at the moment. This is one area that hasn't as yet been entirely devolved to the Welsh Assembly. As a proud Welshman and a proud British citizen, I've never been a supporter of the Assembly, but I support the fact that it's there and that it needs to be made to work as effectively as it can for Wales. It's no secret that I voted against further powers for the Assembly, but I fully accept, like any Democrat, the results of the referendum that took place, and I look forward to working with the Assembly and trying to make a positive contribution to it in energy and in all other areas. And I took actually some heart from the result of the referendum campaign, which I think showed that the vast majority of people in Wales actually, whilst supporting the Assembly in some form, also believe that many powers need to reside at Westminster, and I think that energy is a case in point. And it was interesting that so many of those who were campaigning for a yes vote were saying, we'll go this far, but we don't want to take it any further. Don't listen to the nationalists. I will in a minute, delighted. But let me just finish, because I was about to talk about the nationalists. They were campaigning in Caerphilly on the lines of, we will not campaign with the nationalists, they said, because unlike them, we think that these powers will be enough and we don't want to see it go any further. They campaigned for a yes vote on the basis that they were supporters of the Union, and I'd be delighted to hear a contribution from the Honourable Member on that.
Speaking of duality, does he remember canvassing for the chair of the Select Committee, saying he'd have no part in the no campaign, and then suddenly announcing on the Tuesday before that he was in fact in favour of a no vote?
No, I actually made it clear. No. Let me correct the honourable gentleman. His memory is deceiving him. I said that I would take no part in the campaign, and I took no. And may I say, I took no part in the campaign. However, I did also say that it was very important that people should have a right to know what my views were, and I let them know what my views were, but I didn't do so through the umbrella of the No campaign. I took no involvement in any of their meetings, and in fact they held a public meeting in Monmouthshire in Usk just before the referendum. I was asked if I would go along and speak, and I declined on the basis that it was important to maintain neutrality. So I don't think I've got any sort of a guilty conscience over that. Now, sir, coming back to energy, which, as I said before, I think should remain very much within the prerogative of the UK government. I think one way to ensure that would be to allow the only part of the United Kingdom which doesn't yet have its own parliament to have one. I'm referring to England, of course, and I think if we did that and we made it clear which parts of energy and which parts of all other policies were going to be devolved to the regional assemblies or the regional parliaments and which parts weren't, we would actually underpin the Union in a way that supporters of the Assembly and people concerned about the Assembly could thoroughly support. All those in favour of the Union of the United Kingdom, and I think most of us in this room are, could support the idea of an English Parliament to underpin that union, and I think that that's something that we need to go forward and think about.
In terms of his proposal, surely there is a problem on this sort of David and Goliath side. Wales only 3 million people out of 60 million, so would his case logically lead to 20, say, separate legislatures of 3 million people dotted around England? Perhaps that would be more consistent, because otherwise it would be very unbalanced.
Mr Davies, before you resume, I've allowed you to stray into constitutional territory. I would like you to get back to energy policy, please.
Fine. Anyway, Mr Chairman, you have been extremely kind to me. We all know who won the battle between David and Goliath. Let me return to the subject which I most wanted to talk about, which is energy. Now, I'm a big supporter of the government policy of reducing our requirement for carbon-based fuels. I have a slightly different reason for supporting it. I'm not convinced that all of the temperature rises which have currently taken place over the last 250 years are as a result of man-made carbon emissions. It seems to be fairly obvious that we've had periods of warmer and colder cycles over the last 2,000 years. It was warmer when the Romans were here, then it got colder through the Dark Ages, it got warmer again, then it got cold during the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age ended, coincidentally, at around about the time that we started to develop the steam engine and to industrialise, and therefore the Earth would have been getting warmer quite naturally anyway to some extent, because we were coming out of a cold period. Actually, most people who've looked at the facts would find that very hard to imagine, very hard to disagree with, unless, of course, you think that naturally we would still be in the little ice age, which most scientists think ended round about 1650.
Is there a doctor in the house?
I don't know whether he's referring to a medical one or one of those people who've gone off to Polytechnic and done one exam more than anyone else, but I'm neither. But I do know how to read out my statistics properly. I'm also not convinced about the arguments about peak oil. Most of the people, certainly.
On that point, can we accept now that, 99% of the scientific community accept, when you look at a simple chart looking at global warming, it can be explained through natural causes, the sun and earthquakes and all the rest to a certain extent. And we take all that out. All the recent last couple of 100 years, the differences are now explained through human activity. And this is not doubted by virtually anybody other than the right honourable member and a few other maverick
if the honourable gentleman looks at what I said I'm not convinced that all of the rises in temperature that have taken place as a result of man-made carbon emissions. I'm prepared to accept that some of them have, but I'm not prepared to accept that all of them have, and all too often the argument is framed in terms of this is the rise in temperature and it's all down to the fact that man has been emitting carbon. That's the message that goes out. I'm also not convinced about the arguments around peak oil, not least because many of the people who make the arguments about peak oil are also the same ones making the arguments about global warming. Now, if you stop and think about it for a minute, if one stops to think about it, it's not entirely a logical argument to be saying on the one hand, Mr. Davies, stop all carbon emissions, stop burning oil and pulling it out of the ground because it's heating up the earth, and then the next week to be in there saying, Mr. Davies, the oil's about to run out, and therefore we must start to build an economy based around basket weaving and other Stone Age type skills because that's all that's going to be left. If that's the case, then, and you believe it, then fine. But stop worrying about global warming, because if the oil's about to run out, then we're not going to be burning any more of it, so the Earth isn't going to be getting warmer anyway. And for some reason, I've never had an answer as to why it is that the same people who believe in peak oil are also the ones who believe most fanatically in global warming. And I tell you, it worries me. When the honourable gentleman says conspiracy, it does worry me because actually, although I probably don't always communicate myself very well, I read the arguments on all sides. I have children too. I hope to have grandchildren one day, and I don't want to do anything that's going to damage the Earth. But you know what worries me is when I make these comments or raise these questions, people look at me as though I've just blasphemed in some way. In fact, far worse than that, because blasphemy is perfectly acceptable these days. But questioning the idea that every single rising temperature that's taken place in 1750 is as a result of man-made carbon emissions, and that the only way to get around this is to completely abandon industrialisation of all sorts and return to some sort of a pre-industrial era, is seen as something that shall not be spoken of under any circumstances. So I dismiss those. But you see, I actually agree thoroughly with the idea of getting rid of our dependence on carbon because of the instability of the regions from which we derive most of those fuels. Our gas is coming in from parts of the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. Our oil is mainly coming in from the Middle East. I think about 10 or 15% is coming from Saudi Arabia. And much of it has to travel through unstable parts of the world in order to get here. And to me, it absolutely makes sense from any point of view that we should reduce our reliance on gas and oil simply because we cannot rely on the regions that are currently supplying it to us. And therefore, what we should be doing, and are doing to some extent, is thinking about alternative methods of energy generation. What we hear a lot about is wind power, and I'm not against wind power in any way. I think there's a place for wind power, but it is never going to be able to supply the base load of electricity that we need. We're never going to be able to rely on wind power to supply the large amounts of electricity that we need at the times that we need it. And that's another reason why I think we were right to think carefully before going ahead with a 7th barrage. Because the reality is, I will give way on this point, but whilst it may have been able to generate the large amounts of electricity being spoken of, although as everyone accepts it was a first, so we'd have had to have waited with bated breath to some extent, it couldn't have generated that electricity exactly at the time that we needed it. And one of the biggest engineering problems that we face at the moment is the fact that there is no efficient way of storing electricity. I give way.
I just wondered if the honourable gentleman was aware that during the recent cold weather over Christmas, that up to 20% of the whole UK's gas supply was coming through 2 terminals in the Milford Haven. At around the same time, slightly less than 2% of our energy requirements were delivered by wind power.
I think the honourable gentleman makes a very important point, and it's one that we should think about. And in terms of thinking of solutions that should keep happy everyone, whether they're the most ardent environmentalist to the most realistic user of oil or gas, to me the obvious answer to the problem of how we're going to get large amounts of electricity at the times that we need them is to use nuclear power.
Paul Williams.
I'm very grateful for the honourable member giving way. There is, of course, a way to store electricity, and the prime example in the UK is in my constituency in the Dinorwig pumped storage scheme, which can produce sufficient electricity to supply Manchester for 3 hours at the flick of the switch in 8 seconds. Now, if we had more of that sort of facility, we might be able to store electricity more efficiently.
The honourable gentleman makes a very important point, but it's still not 100% efficient. I think that using water to generate turbines, water that's been placed into placed further up, if you like, than the turbines, is only about 80% efficient. That's still very, very good, but it will only work if you've got the right geographical basis to make it work, and it's not going to be available across the whole of the United Kingdom. So I welcome that. I think there are other means as well. We can use electricity from wind at some point to possibly run electric currents through water and generate hydrogen, which can be used in cars and buses and is being. But that technology really is decades away from being affordable. So there are solutions in the future and over the next few decades, but we face a problem right now in that many of our power stations, coal, gas and nuclear, are going to close over the next 10 years, and there simply isn't going to be enough electricity. And again, the environmental movement need to think about this. At the moment, there's a lot of goodwill towards them. Most people in most parties are signed up to most of the agenda. But, you know, we're all politicians and we recognise some realities here. If the flat screen TVs go off and the lights go out, then the public aren't going to be worried about the possibility of global warming in 50 years. They're going to be saying to politicians of all parties, get your act together right now and get the electricity back on right now, and we don't care how you do it. And if we're not prepared to do it in the quickest way possible, then somebody else will get elected who will, and that will probably mean coal-fired power stations going up all over the place. So we need to think about this, and they need to think about it as well. Nuclear power does not generate any carbon dioxide emissions. It is reliable. There is no issue about security of supply. People say that the uranium is going to run out in 50 years' time. Well, the first thing is that most of it is mined in places like Australia, which are inherently stable countries. We don't have more than 50 years' worth that we know about because we're not looking for it. And in any case, there are 2 isotopes of uranium, and a scientist could explain it better than I could. And we're only using one at the moment, and the other one is in plentiful supply, and we could adapt and use that if we wanted to.
Give way,
of course.
In evidence that was given to the Welsh Affairs Committee in the last 2 years, the nuclear energy providers admitted themselves that uranium was a finite resource. And when they were asked this question, they said that they currently had lots of people out there looking for more uranium. So we don't have a steady uranium source. It is actually depleting rapidly, and they are desperately searching for more.
David Davies.
I'd probably take my career into my hands here, except that I suspect not every... I've done that many times, yes. Not every scientist in the whole of the UK is going to be poring over this debate, I suspect. I think the answer to the honourable lady's point is that there are 2 isotopes of uranium. There is uranium-235 and uranium-237. Now, one of those is in use in most nuclear power stations across the world. I think it might be 2, 3... I listen out for inspiration here, but let me guess that it's 5, and there is apparently about 50 years' worth left. The other isotope can be used in certain types of nuclear power stations, most of which are under test at the moment. There is a lot of it about, and if that ever failed, and I think there's several hundred years' worth of that, then it is possible, believe it or not, to get fissionable material out of seawater. There are actually plenty of alternatives to the current uranium, of which we know of a 50-year supply. So I don't think that security of supply is ever going to be an issue with nuclear power stations. And in any case, the next generation of nuclear power stations would only be expected to last 50 years or so. So it's unlikely to to have to trouble us. By which time, one would hope, we would have developed cold fusion plants and might have moved on in technological terms.
I'm most grateful to my old friend for giving way. I'm listening carefully to what he was saying. But he may also like to welcome the extension of life of the Wilbur project, because that is really important in terms of the way the NDA is finding ways of extending the life of nuclear power stations and more efficient use of fuel and using up those rare fuel supplies that we have left. And that is a good thing. Both in terms of...
Could the Secretary of State address the Chair so that the people trying to make notes can...
Both in terms of income, but also getting maximum usage out of the facility.
David Davies.
I thank the honourable lady for that. I do welcome it, indeed, very much, Mr. Chairman, but not as much as the Member of Parliament for the Ulver area, because it's one of the amazing things about nuclear power stations is that the most enthusiastic supporters tend to be the people in whose constituencies they are built once things have had time to settle down, because of the high range of well-paid, well-skilled jobs that they provide. Even members of Parliament, dare I say it, whose political parties are not known for being supporters of nuclear power, have a sudden change of heart when somebody threatens closing one down in the constituency. And that's why, actually, I mean, the honourable gentleman from Newport West is no longer in his place, but he put the point to me about, well, you know, how would you like it if there was one in Monmouthshire? The answer is that nobody wants to live next door to a nuclear power station, or a gas-fired power station, or a coal station, or an industrial estate of any sort. We all like our houses to be in nice residential areas with other houses. But my constituency has been opposite the nuclear power station of Oldbury for many, many years, and it hasn't been a big problem for the vast majority of people in the constituency, and it won't be if it's rebuilt. I give way again.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and of course he's making a very accurate point that those who live near nuclear power stations frequently don't mind them, and in fact many politicians actually do support them, and of course the prime example is the honourable member for Ynys-Môn. But even more remarkable, would he not acknowledge, is the conversion of the Assembly member for Ynys-Môn, who is the leader of Plaid Cymru, a party which is opposed to nuclear generation, but nevertheless supports it in his own constituency.
Davies.
I think it's the... I think it's the road to Damascus obviously leads to Ynys-Môn, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've covered the referendum, global warming, the energy crisis, and nuclear power. There are many other members who want to speak, and I'm more than happy to sit down and listen to their contributions. Thank you very much.
David Hanson.